Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. This time around, I want to talk about record IDs, specifically record IDs when you're creating flows in Salesforce. If you've been watching the Flow Along series on YouTube, then you know that in our previous video, we created our first screen flow in Salesforce. When we were creating that screen flow, we had to create a new variable called record ID. And the purpose of this variable was to capture the ID of the record that triggered the flow. After we created that flow, I realized that this record ID concept might be a bit confusing for some people, especially if you're just starting out. I remember when I was starting out, I never really understood this record ID and how it worked and how it picked up the record that I was clicking on and why I needed to even use it. But I knew that by doing it, it made my flows work, so I kept doing it. But I think now that we are in a position where we've already created a few flows, I think this is a good time to understand how this record ID variable actually works and what are some of the best ways that you can implement that within your flow, especially when you're making a flow where you want to reuse the same flow across multiple objects. So without any further delay, I'm going to jump right into Salesforce. I'm going to show you a quick example of a use case where we want to use the same flow for two different objects. And then we're going to jump on the flow builder together and we're going to create that flow. And as we're creating it, I'm going to be explaining the record ID variable. So here we are in Salesforce and I'm going to navigate to my accounts object and then I'm going to click on any random account. Now, on the top right-hand side of the page, you see that we have a quick action called record ID. If I click on this quick action, this flow, this screen flow is triggered and launched, and we can see the name field automatically populated with the name of the account record that triggered this flow. So in this case, we're using Burlington Textiles Corp of America, and we can see that this text field has been auto-populated with this account name. Now, if I come out of this and I go back to my accounts object and I just launch another account, this one for example, and I click on that record ID, you can see that the same process is applied and this new account name is now displayed in this text field. So this is half of what our flow is currently doing. If I now navigate to a different object, say the contact object, and I click on a contact, if I click on that same record ID quick action, you can see that it has now pulled the contact name to this text field instead of the account name. So we're using the same screen flow across two separate objects. And what we're using to fetch the record ID is this record ID variable that we've been talking about. So let's jump onto the flow builder and let's build this flow together. I'm going to do this time around by going on my app launcher or the 9 dots on the top left side of my page, and I'm going to search for automation. And then this will open up the new automations app as part of Summer 24. And here what I want to do is on the right hand side, I want to click new. And that's going to launch that new flow creation for me. So this is just another way that you can create a new flow. You don't always have to go to setup, search for flows, and then click new flow. You can use the automation app if you want to. So I'm going to start from scratch and then I'm going to select screen flow. Now here we are in our screen flow. Now, if you have been watching my videos and you've watched my previous video, then you'd know by now that with screen flows, there is nothing to do with the start element. So you have to start your flow by using an element within your canvas. So I'm going to add a new element and I'm going to do the accounts bit first. So I'm going to add a get element because I want to get the account record. And so I'll call this get account. And then for objects, I'll select account. Now, this element is going to fetch me an account record or many account records. That's really up to me. And I can set that option down here. So at the very bottom, it says how many records to store. I can say store only one record that matches the criteria that I'm going to add above, or get all the records. But since we're only getting one record, I need to tell this element which record to get. And so you would think that's easy enough, right? Because the record that this element should fetch is the record that I launched the flow from. But this isn't an option. You can't add this as a value or a resource or a field within this element. Let me show you. So here under filter account records, I have a field section and I can search for all the fields that exists on my account object. And so here I want to search for the ID field. Now I have an operator that I can select. And then on the right hand side, I have a value. So if I enter a value here, I'm basically saying, get me an account record that belongs to the account object where the ID of this record is the same as the whatever value I put in this value box. And if you click on the value box, you have some options of things that you can select. And you can go through all of these in your own time, but I can guarantee you there is no option here that says the record that launched the flow. And so you might be thinking, well, how do we find a record that launched the flow, that triggered the flow? And the way to do this is by creating this variable where you give it a specific name and it automatically stores that ID for you. So to do this, we need to click on New Resource. This new resource page opens up and we're able to select a resource type. Now, if you don't know what a variable is, think of a variable like a bucket, an empty bucket. So you're creating a bucket that's empty. There is nothing in it. And we're going to give this bucket a label. And then when we launch our flow, we're going to put the record ID of the record that triggered our flow into this empty bucket. So the bucket won't be empty anymore. This bucket or this variable will contain an ID value. And then we're going to use this get element that we're creating now within our flow to fetch the right account record that has the ID value that's within our bucket or our variable. So we'll go ahead and click variable here, and we have to enter a variable API name. Now, this is where you want to be careful because you need to have this specific name. And the name is record ID. So as you can see here, I'm going to type in record. Nothing has caps. And then the I from ID is a capitalized I. So lowercase record and capitalized I and then lowercase d. Record ID where only the I is capitalized. You don't really need to add a description. For data type, you want to select text. And then this is really important as well, where it says availability outside the flow, you want to make sure you select available for input. Why do you want to do this? That's because the bucket that you're creating, this variable that you're creating, when you tick this box, you're saying that outside of this flow, this bucket, this variable is available for other values to be pushed inside of the bucket, to be pushed inside of the variable. For example, if you're launching your flow by embedding it on a Lightning record page, the record page will allow you to push the record ID into this variable, but only if this checkbox is ticked. If it's not going to allow you to do that, which means it's not going to allow you to capture the record ID that triggered the flow. So when you finish, you go ahead and click done. Now we know that we're getting the right account record. So the next thing we need to do in our flow is create a screen, because this is a screen flow after all. So we go ahead and create a screen. And here we can just say main screen. I'm not too bothered about that. I'm going to tidy up my header and my footer. I'm going to hide previous and I'm going to hide pause. So now what we want to do is we want to add a component, and we go ahead and add a text component here. And we're going to call this account name. And what we're going to do is for default value, because we want to automatically display that account name into this component for us, for default value, we're going to find our get element, that element that's getting our account record. We're going to click on that, and then we're going to search for account name. So here's our account name. Now we're going to hit done, and we're going to save this flow. So let's call this account screen flow name display. Displays the account name. And then we're going to hit save, and let's activate this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the front end. I'm going to go to setup. I'm going to go to my account object, and I'm going to go to the quick actions setting. I'm going to find that record ID quick action that I already had, and I'm going to edit that action to include my new flow, which is called account name display, and I'm going to hit save. Now what I can do is I can go to my sales app, and if I find an account record, I can then click on the record ID quick action, and that should display the account name. So here it is. So far, so good. Now, what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go back to Object Manager. I'm going to search for contact. I'm going to find that same quick action that we used at the beginning of the video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that same flow to this quick action as well. But I'm adding it to the contact record. So if I now go to a contact record and click on record ID, you see that account name is not populated. And you might be thinking, well, why is that? We're getting the record ID that triggered our flow. Why is the name not being displayed? Well, the reason for that is because if we go back to our flow, you can see that our element is getting the account record within the account object. And we just launched our flow from the contact object. And so that's a different object altogether. That's never going to work. So what we need to do is we need to have the same get records element for the contact object. And we can do that. So if I create a new get element, and I'll say get contact this time around. Now I'll select the contact object. For field, I'll select ID. And then here you might be thinking, okay, let's create a new variable. But hold on, if we have to call it record ID in that specific naming convention, how am I going to be able to do that? That's going to get confusing. Do I need a new variable? Can I use the same variable? What can I label my new variable? Don't panic. You can actually use the same variable. You don't need to create a new one. Why is that? Well, that's because when you're launching this flow, you're either going to launch it from the account record or from the contact record. You can't ever launch it from the account and the contact record together because they're separate objects. And so if you launch the flow from the account, what's going to happen is that it's going to fetch an account, it's going to fail fetching a contact, and then it's going to go over to the next element, which is the screen. Or if you launch it from the contact, it's going to fail getting the account because there was no account. Then it's going to get the contact, and then it's going to follow up by triggering the screen. Now you might be thinking that doesn't sound like best practice. And the truth is, it isn't. This isn't best practice. In fact, I've seen many flows be built this way, and I, for one, have built many flows in this manner. But even though it's not best practice, we are going to be doing it this way for now, because I'm trying to teach you, I'm trying to show you how this record ID really behaves. And then after that, I'm going to show you how you should really be building these flows by using a best practice approach. And I know that would be a best practice approach because I have actually gone myself and checked with the experts within the community and asked them what they think is the best practice when dealing with scenarios like this. Because although I might be here trying to teach you something that you don't know, it doesn't mean that I know everything. In fact, I by far don't know everything, and I'm still learning, just like you. But I do know this, and so I am able to share my knowledge with you. Okay, enough of that. Let's move on. So we're getting our contact now. We're using the same record ID variable. And now what we need to do is in our screen element, we need to add a new text component here. And we're going to call this contact name. And then for default value, we simply get our contact element, and here we search for full name. Okay, happy days. But we do want to add some visibility filters here because I don't want to see account name when I launch it from a contact. And I don't want to see a contact name when I launch it from an account. So I'm going to select my account component. I'm going to add a component visibility. So I'm just going to say when the resource get account ID is null, is false, then I want you to display this field. So only display the account name when the account ID element is not empty. And I'm going to do the same for the contact here. This time I'm going to use the get contact element. I'm going to use the contact ID. Operator is null, and then the value is false. So now what we can do is we can save this flow. Go ahead and save that. And we'll activate it. And then I'm going to go back to the front end. I'm just going to hit refresh here. And let's see how this works. So I am on a contact record. If I click record ID, I can see that the contact name is automatically populated. So this bit is working as expected. Now, if I go to my account, and if I go on a account record and I click on record ID, I can see that the account name is being populated. So I know that my flow is working, but I also know that one of the elements in my flow will always fail. And we can see that if we debug the flow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy a account ID, and then I'm going to go back to my flow and I'm going to hit debug. And because we made that record ID variable available for input, I can now paste an ID into this variable, and then I can debug the flow. And so we can see here, if we look on the right-hand side under debug details, our flow has started, the get account element was triggered, and it successfully found records because this ID belongs to an account record. And then it moved on to the get contact, but it failed to find the contact. Again, because this record is an account record, and it will always either be an account or a contact. It will never be both at the same time. And then after it failed getting the contact, it moved on to the screen. Now, if I leave my flow like this, what would happen is every time my flow is triggered, either the first element or the second element would fail. And that's bad practice. And so what we need to do is we need to change this approach. And we can do this by using a decision element. So I'll go ahead and create a decision element here. And I'm going to call this account or contact. And then for the first outcome, I'm going to call it account. And then for the second outcome, I'm going to call it contact. And then for the default outcome, I'm just going to leave this one as is. Now, when it comes to the first outcome, we now need a way to figure out how we can tell this decision whether or not this is an account record. Now, you might be thinking, that's fine because I can reference my get account element within the resource. But let's think about this. The get account element is going to be after this decision. It's going to be within one of these decisions branches. So we can't reference that account element because that is what will come after the branch is triggered. But what we can do is we can select the variable. Now, the variable is that empty bucket that I was explaining to you earlier, and this is automatically going to have the record ID added into this bucket as soon as the flow is triggered. And so by adding the record ID as a resource, we can now select the operator to check whether the ID inside this bucket or this variable starts with a specific number value. So in order to check this, we can open up ChatGPT and we can say in Salesforce, account records starts with which 3 numbers. And ChatGPT should tell us that the prefix is 001. So here it is. In Salesforce, an account record ID typically starts with a 3-character prefix 001. So that's awesome. So what we can say here is we're asking this decision, check the variable. If it starts with a 001 prefix, then we know it's an account record, in which case go down the account branch. And let's do the same for contact. We select the record ID variable, and if it starts with, and again, if you don't know what contact starts with, you can ask GPT. How about contacts? It should be 003. There we go. Starts with a prefix of 003. And so here you can just add 003. And now that we have this decision set up, all we need to do is we just need to cut our element and paste it under the right decision branch. So I'll cut contact now, and I'll put it under the contact branch. Now we can see that our decision is going to check which object our flow was triggered, and then it's going to go down that branch, which means that if we trigger our flow from the account object, our contact element is not going to fail because it's now divided within a decision element. So because we have some pink elements in our canvas, we really should start using fault paths. So I'm going to go ahead and create one. I'm going to click on that element, and then I'm going to click add fault path. And I'm going to do the same for contact. I'm going to add a fault path here too. Now within this fault path, we do need to do something. We can't just leave it as an empty fault path. Otherwise, it's pretty useless. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new screen. But I'm going to create this screen under the default outcome branch of my decision. Because I know that I'm either going to be launching this flow from the account or the contact. And so if it fails within the decision, it's going to go down the default branch anyway. So I'm going to create a screen here, and I'm going to call this fault screen. And then within this screen, I'm going to tidy it up a little bit, and I'm going to get rid of the hide. And then I'm going to add a display text component. Call this fault message. And then in here, I'm going to add a resource. I'm going to go down in the options. I'm going to select flow, and I'm going to select fault message. And then I'm going to hit done. So this is our fault screen. Now what I can do is just connect those fault paths to that fault screen. And that way I don't need to create loads of different screens to capture the fault. I can just create one, and it captures all of the faults from all the fault paths that I have in my flow. So this is looking much better now. I think this really aligns a lot closer to best practices. We're not failing elements on purpose, and we're a lot more organized. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now our name has changed, our label for our flow. We're not just account, we're actually account and contact now. Display account name or contact name. So I'm just going to tidy this up a little bit, and then I'm going to hit save. So now what I want to do is I want to activate this flow, and let's test it one final time. So I'm going to go back to the front end of Salesforce and just hit refresh. I'm on an account record, and I'm going to hit the record ID quick action, and I can see that it does display the account name. So far so good. I'm going to do the same thing for a contact, and we can see that it does in fact display the contact name. And just for my own sanity, I'm going to check another random contact. And yeah, it does pull the correct name. But one final thing I want to do is I want to debug that flow. So here I have a contact, and I'm going to copy this contact ID, and I'm going to debug our flow one more time. So here's the new version of our flow. I'm going to debug this flow. And now we can see on the right-hand side that the first thing that happened is the flow hit that decision. And in that decision, we had an outcome to execute. And the outcome that we executed in this particular example was the contact, because we added a contact ID, which starts with a prefix of 003. And so here we can see that the get contact element has fetched us the right contact ID because we're using that record ID variable that we've been discussing. But most importantly, the get account element did not fail because that is now housed under a branch of a decision that was never executed. So in other words, we were able to create a flow whereby we're utilizing the record ID variable to automatically pick up the record ID of the record that triggered our flow. And then secondly, instead of having two get elements, one after each other, where we know that one of them is always bound to fail, we've now added a decision element with a very simple object prefix to check which object is launching the flow, and then the get element within that decision branch, so that when that decision outcome is executed, only that get element is triggered and only that record is fetched. Okay, so before I forget, there is just one last quick thing we need to do here, and that is after our fault screen, we just need to make sure that we end our flow. So that's the only last thing we need to do here. That way, when we hit the fault screen, the flow ends and it doesn't do anything else. Just go ahead and hit save and save this new version of the flow and then activate it. I hope I explained that well and that you found this video helpful. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop in the comments down below and I'll be more than happy to assist. Until next time.